If the assassination could trammel up the consequences and catch with his surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here. That's from Macbeth, my favorite play by the great William Shakespeare. It's about a Scottish general who wants to be the king. The problem is the current king is a great king and also his cousin. He decides to give up the idea of becoming the king, but his wife wants to be the queen so badly, she convinces him to kill his own cousin. So Macbeth and Lady Macbeth become the new king and queen. But things don't turn out too well for either one of them. Some people say my becoming president is a little like the story of Macbeth, but I must disagree with them. It's true, I did have political ambition and would have liked to have been a U.S. Senator. And it's true that it was my wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, who had set her cap to marry a man destined to be the president. Her family influence and personal counsel did help me to become the 16th president of the United States of America. But a tyrant I am not. Perhaps that is in part thanks to the great bard's warning. I've read Shakespeare since I was a child and was lucky enough to have a book of his works growing up. Macbeth always stuck with me. I even carried a small copy of it in my pocket when I was a young lawyer going from town to town. I still carry many recitations of Shakespeare with me. Not in my pocket, in my mind. Those great words and universal truths have been with me through my days as a lawyer, my rise to the presidency, through the devastation of war, the tragedy of deep personal loss, and to this very day as I share with you my story. Unlike the kings and nobility of Shakespeare, I grew up in a small cabin in rural Kentucky. Now, I may be the president today, but I guarantee you that I have the least amount of formal education of everyone here today. All totaled, I had a little over 1 year of formal schooling. If it wasn't for my stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, I wouldn't have had hardly any schooling. She was the case, which was the case, I should say, for many frontier children of my ilk. We had what was called subscript schools, where you paid for the schooling, which was only 3 months out of the year. It was from January to March, so as not to interfere with the growing and harvest season. So, if I never went to school, how did I manage to serve 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, become a lawyer, and serve 1 term as a congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives, let alone president? Well, I'm what you call an autodidact. Now that's a $25 word that means I am self-taught. From the time I was a boy, I always carried a book and read whenever I got the chance. If my father caught me reading instead of chopping wood or doing chores, I was at a risk of getting a whooping, but it was worth it to me. Father and I never quite saw eye to eye, but he was a good man who meant well. Well, I remember one time when I was about 19 or 20, we was moving to Illinois and our wagon was on a flatboat crossing a river. We soon realized our dog Jib was left behind. Father said, "Leave him." I didn't say a word. Instead, I jumped in the water, swam back home, got Jib, swam back with him in hand, exhausted. Father berated me and said I was a fool to do such a thing. I told him my feet are cold, but both me and Jib are a lot happier. At this young age, I also got a glimpse of what working without pay was like. You see, it was the custom for a father to rent their children out to work other farms and then keep the money for himself until the son was about 21. This was, of course, nowhere near the indignities of forced servitude as that was put upon the Negroes. but it did make me consider the unfairness of work without compensation at a young age. Those experiences were valuable to me, but I did not know just how valuable then. I'm what you might call a people person. I enjoy the company of others and getting to know folks like yourself. I got to know many folks when my friend Barry and I put in a post office in town and had me deliver mail and talk to people around the county. Oftentimes I'd carry letters in my hat, a tall one, so as to keep a good many letters. And later, when I did my surveying job, I met even more people where I became known as one of the best stump talkers around. This led to a lifetime of listening to people and learning what was important to them. Now that's a rare quality for a politician, I've come to learn. Now meeting all these county people is in large part, I believe, what eventually led me to be elected to the Illinois legislature, thus beginning my life in politics. But if you want to know how I got where I am here today, you have to meet my wife, Mary Todd. I call her Molly, or Mother, and she is smarter, better educated, speaks French fluently, and has more political ambition than anyone I ever met. She let it be known from the time she was a little girl, she will be a president's wife one day. I do believe that if women were allowed to vote and were allowed to be president, she'd be in the White House running the country. When I courted Mary Todd, she was also being courted by Stephen Douglas. He was my rival for Mary Todd and my political opponent many times over the years, including for the presidency of the United States of America. Mary decided I was the best horse to bet on for the presidency, and as usual, she was right. Now, one habit that has served me well is to write ideas on little scraps of paper. I put them away, or I carry them in a hat, and I think about all sides of the issue I'm examining. So one problem I spent an inordinate amount of time reconciling is, why is one man a slave and another man a slave owner? This issue of slavery has been an albatross around the neck of our country since our founding fathers wrote the Constitution, and even before that with our colonist ancestors. And it has led to a fractured nation. The southern states thought it was my election, that with my election, I would abolish slavery, which they felt was a necessary part of their way of life. Now, this notion that I would abolish slavery was completely false. I tried to reassure our southern citizens that I was not intending to abolish slavery, but I was not going to allow the further spread of slavery to any new states or territories. Despite the ideals of our Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, our Constitution allowed for slavery. And a president's job is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. My duty to the Constitution also required that I preserve the union of the whole United States of America. This terrible Civil War boiled down to the northern states wanting to preserve the Union and the southern states wanting to maintain the institution of slavery. It was not until later in the war that the ideals of freedom and equality would come to the forefront of this war. I have men like Frederick Douglass, the great Negro orator and abolitionist, to thank, as well as women like Harriet Tubman, the Moses of the Negroes, who led so many of them to their freedom. They and other abolitionists created a movement and shift in the American people that gave us a sacred cause in this fight to preserve the Union. I could not have predicted such a momentous victory for freedom when I was just a country lawyer. From the moment I was elected president, the seeds of war were sown. It was well known my life was in grave danger from the get-go. One of the saddest moments of my life was having to say goodbye to my good friend and law partner, William Herndon. When I left Springfield, Illinois, we both knew it was very unlikely I would ever return. Heading to Washington to begin my presidency in March of 1861, I made a grand whistle stop a tour that made about 90 stops to see and talk to people all over our country. When I got close to Washington, D.C., the Pinkerton Detective Agency discovered a plot to assassinate me, so I had to sneak into Washington disguised under the cover of night. On Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1861, there were agents and soldiers all over the Capitol grounds to ensure my safety. I was met by President Buchanan that day, who surprised me by saying, "If you're as happy about becoming president as I'm happy about leaving this office, then you're a very happy man." Well, it didn't take long to see war was inevitable. So I had Postmaster General Montgomery Blair ask one of the finest generals to graduate from West Point Military Academy, Bobby Lee, to head up our Union Army. After much consideration, he decided he had better be loyal to his native state of Virginia, and instead he ended up leading the Southern Confederate Army. I'll tell you now, he darn near whooped us. In 1862, the war was not going well for us. And to make matters worse, I lost my son Willie to cholera, caused by our troops putting their filth in the Potomac River, which was our water supply. I confess, if there is a place worse than hell, I was in it. What's more is that a conflict arose in the Dakota Territory between the Sioux Indians and the settlers. The Sioux Indians had been removed to lands where crops had failed and hunting was no good. They were to be paid an annuity to support themselves and trade with Indian agents. These payments were not received, and we have learned that there is widespread corruption in the system of Indian agents, with some agents having taken thousands and even tens of thousands of dollars that were meant to go to the Sioux. And so a faction of the Sioux attacked the settlers on their former lands, killing hundreds, creating a widespread panic. A military commission sentenced 303 Sioux men to death. Well, upon learning this, I insisted that all documents be sent to me and my team of lawyers. I was anxious to not act with so much clemency as to encourage another even more deadly outbreak on one hand, nor with so much severity as to sentence 303 Sioux men to death. I described this conflict by saying, necessity knows no law. A decision had to be made. From the 303, the list was decreased to 38 men who were determined to have participated in the massacre, which is to be said on the cause of this. Had the Sioux been granted their annuity and the ability to support themselves, I believe this would not have happened. This system must be reformed, and I intend to see to its reform in my next term. But the present preservation of our Union is the focus of my attention here in 1862. Now, at that time, our chances of ensuring that preservation did not look good. Other forces were also at play. There was a real threat that England and France may help the Southern cause. Something had to be done to stop this possibility. Also, it was obvious that the war had become about slavery, and it had to be abolished in order to stop this war and any future wars. So my administration came to the conclusion we needed to emancipate, to free and liberate the slaves. This Emancipation Proclamation freed all the slaves in the states that were part of the Southern Confederation, and also it allowed black men to become soldiers in the Union Army. The impact the Emancipation Proclamation had on England and France is it kept them from joining the Southern cause. You see, their citizens would not fight a war to keep slavery in place. The final blow to slavery in our country was passing the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that ended slavery in our country for good. This was a difficult fight for some, very difficult political fight, but sometimes, by the grace of God, right makes might. With the passing of the 13th Amendment, we finally kept that claim Mr. Jefferson wrote in our Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. And as I stated in the Gettysburg Address, that our nation will have a new birth of freedom, and that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people will not perish from this earth. Well, as it is Friday, April 14th, 1865, it's been 5 days since Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox, and I am finally happy and relieved that this terrible war is coming to an end. I'm going to relax and enjoy a carriage ride with my wife and let her know I'd like to visit California. I want to go see our very first national park called Yosemite, which I'm proud to say my administration was able to accomplish, and thereby preserving some of the natural beauty of our country for future generations. Then, I'm going to go spend some time with my friends and secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay. Now, they don't know it yet. I'm going to ask them to be the ambassadors to Great Britain. And tonight, it's off to the play at Ford's Theater to see Our American Cousin. I understand it's a very funny play, and Lord knows I can use a laugh. Although, knowing me, I'll go right back to the tragedies of Shakespeare ere long. But before I go, I do have some time for some questions. What might you like to know?
All right, hello everyone. Liva here from behind the scenes. So if you do have any questions, feel free to chat those. And I'll start off with some questions. Now, Mr. Lincoln, you did mention your parents and their influence on you. I wonder if you could speak to how they raised you and what kind of people that they were.
Okay, I'll be happy to. Now, I will say, every time that I'm asked to give a historical presentation or write out a history of me, I do give the warning that anything in my past is to get a glimpse of me in the present is pure folly. But I do believe that people are the children of their conditions and the circumstances they are born into and the influence around them. I was certainly molded by my conditions. I feel that all that I am or hope ever to be, I got from my mother, Nancy. She was very intelligent despite her modest education, deeply kind and generous with her motherly love, and strong. She was known for her athleticism and even wrestled with a few neighbors. Religious woman, too, brought up in the Baptist church. She sadly died when I was only 9 years old, and she had milk sickness, which is a deadly illness that occurs when you drink the milk of a cow who has eaten white snake root. To this day, I refer to her as my angel mother, for that is what she was on earth and what she is now. Now, my father, as I said, we didn't see eye to eye. Thomas Lincoln, he was no intellectual. He was a quiet man with strict morals. And I got to say, I got to cut him a little bit of slack. When he was 6 years old, he saw his own father murdered by, we think, an Iroquois Indian. If his brother Mordecai hadn't been smart and quick enough to grab the rifle and shoot that Indian, he was also ready, fixing to kill my father as well at that time. So he had a hard go of it bringing up. And but he did install some good things into me, I will have to say. If you ever heard me that I was called Honest Abe, you can thank my father for instilling that principle of honesty in me. He was strong and a hard-working man. He was a carpenter. When I was 8 years old, my father put an axe in my hand, and that axe would be with me through long days of work for years to come. I chopped down trees and I split rails. In fact, as an adult, I could split 400 10-foot rails in a day. I also built fences. I worked on the farm planting and sowing crops, tended the animals on our farm. We had to work to be successful in such a wilderness, and the family depended on every member. I learned a great many skills, from carpentry to butchering, to operating a ferry. But I was more interested in a different kind of learning, book learning. I can't tell you how many times my father told me reading, he caught me reading instead of working. He gave me quite a scolding. I'd sneak a book with me when I was tending to the fields, and well, I'd take what I thought would be a short break. They weren't so short oftentimes, but that's not to say my father did not want me to learn. He did. There were even times when he'd let me go on reading and do the work himself, but once the work had to be done, he'd give me a shout and get back to it, and I would. I had an older sister. We called her Sally. Her name was actually Sarah, and we were very close. And it was a terrible day when she died as an adult. She'd been married and was expecting a child, but she died during the birth to a stillborn. Turned out she actually had a kidney disease. I eventually had a step-sibling and a stepmother when my father remarried after my mother's death. We were quite fortunate to have a loving family in the new additions to our household. I had a stepbrother, John, a stepsisters, Matilda and Elizabeth, and my cousin Dennis was also still with us. Now, I have to clear up one wrong I've heard about my father when he went courting Sarah Bush, and that was that he left us alone, Sarah and myself, alone in the woods. This isn't true. Dennis was 18 years old, and he was living with us, so we were well tended to and in good hands. But we did have a small cabin, and it was a bit crowded.
Oh, thank you. And I see Susan would like to know, when did you decide to grow a beard, and is there a story about that?
There is indeed. I was running for the presidency, and a young lady, her name is Grace Bedell, she was all of 11 years old. She wrote me a letter, and she said, Mr. Lincoln, I think you're going to look a lot better and become a lot more attractive to lady folks if you would grow whiskers. And so I did at her request, and she was right. We'll credit Grace Bedell as one of the reasons I was actually able to get elected. As it turned out, later on, I was able to go to Winfield, New York, and somebody yelled out Grace was there, and I got to meet her in person. And I went up and kissed each one of her cheeks, and she was quite thrilled, as I was, to meet Grace. So thank you for that question.
Oh, that's a cute story. And now you mentioned growing up in a cabin, and that's been associated with your early childhood. I wonder if you could tell us, what was it like in your early homes? Because I'm sure they just don't compare to the White House, I'm sure.
No, they didn't. That's for certain. In fact, one house I remember in particular, we were moving to Indiana. We didn't have any place to live, so my father put up a lean-to, three-sided cabin. The only thing that kept the cold out was a fire in front of it. So, yeah, it was pretty rudimentary living. But the first home I do remember was a log cabin measuring 16 by 18 feet with a dirt floor, large fireplace, and a single window with no glass. Instead, we used greased paper. We moved around a bit in my early years, first to a large farm of some 230 acres surrounded by beautiful Kentucky hills. And then we ended up in Indiana, and you must wonder why we moved from such a property. It was in part because of slavery. You see, both my parents belonged to anti-slavery sects of the Baptist Church, and living in a town where slavery was allowed meant it was also hard for my father to find work. Why pay a carpenter a fair price when you can pay so much less for slave labor? There was also great issues with land titles, inaccurate land surveys, and claims over the land in Kentucky at that time. In fact, it was said in Kentucky, you didn't buy land, you bought a lawsuit. So we moved to Indiana, where there was no slavery, and the land was properly surveyed and sold by the federal government. Indiana was quite different from Kentucky. It was wild frontier, bears, wildcats, panthers, swarms of mosquitoes, pigeons flying overhead, and brush so matted and thick surrounding the forest. Yet, my father found a way. He built an 18 by 20 foot cabin that didn't have a floor or windows for a while, and I slept in a tiny loft that required climbing up wood pegs to get to it. We lived there for the next 13 years. After my father married Sarah, there were improvements to our home: a wooden floor, a fixed roof, a sleeping loft for the boys, and a feather bed for the girls. We were finally a happy family, although the new floor had its positives and negatives. Sarah now complained about us tracking mud into the house, but I guess we had to get civilized somehow.
And as far as your upbringing goes, we know that your parents were part of the Baptist church. What was your religious education like?
Well, outside of book learning and work, I had a good spiritual education too. The Baptist Frontier Church was quite different than that of the cities. The preachers often delivered their sermons extemporaneously and with such vigor and emotion, I would be so enamored that I would try and repeat the sermon to my family and friends later on. You see, I'd stand up on a stump or a log and I'd imitate the style of those old preachers. I had a pretty good memory too, and I was quite easy in front of an audience at a young age. I would not consider myself a devoutly religious man. I certainly gained great reflection when I consider the teachings of the Bible, but I also have become skeptical of the less holy aspects of church religion. I do not trust anyone who says that they know God's plan and purpose. I feel that tolerance of other religions outside of one's own is important. My religion, you could say, is the golden rule.
And you also mentioned your education. You were self-taught. What did that look like? Was it just reading books? And you also mentioned your schooling. So, what was your actual formal schooling like?
Well, wasn't a whole lot. Much of my early education was self-taught. All those many hours of reading anything I could get my hands on paid off. When I wanted to write something down, I often did not have paper. I would make a pen out of a turkey buzzard feathers and pokeberry ink. I'd write on walls, fences, and floors. It was allowed. Sometimes I'd even write with charcoal or in the dust or snow. I was taught the basics of spelling and such by neighbors and church folk, but I did attend school later on. But I can't say it was the best that education could afford. There was no other qualification required of a teacher other than reading, writing, and ciphering. And it was called the blab style of school. We just recited out the lessons out loud, something I kind of got in the habit to even to this day. There was no curiosity in those classrooms, and I was a deeply curious student. The books that were most useful and inspirational to me were Aesop's Fables, Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, the Bible, and among others. Now, one of my favorite books was James Riley's Narrative of the Loss of the American Brig Commerce, which had fascinating stories of American and British sailors captured off the Barbary Coast by pirates. Well, pirate stories are exciting to just about any kid. This book also exposed me to the cruelties of slavery. I recall a passage still in my memory. Strange as it must appear to the philanthropist, my proud-spirited and free countrymen still hold 1,000,000 of the human species in the most cruel bonds of slavery, who are kept at hard labor and smarten under the savage lash of unhuman mercenary drivers. Now, I studied histories. I read the stories and biographies of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. I read the newspapers and magazines of the day and made an intellectual of myself out of pure curiosity and eagerness to learn.
Now, I see that you are also well known for being a lover of animals, and I know that you loved animals as a child, and perhaps you could share that same love that you have to this day.
Absolutely. I'd love to. Thank you so much for asking that one. I have a great love of animals. Even as a boy, I hated to go hunting. I always felt a friendship toward animals, knowing that, yes, some animals had to be eaten for food. I never went hunting for the fun of it. I remember as a young boy saying that an ant's life was to it as sweet as ours to us. I spent time working as a butcher and felt terrible anytime I had to put an animal to death. I didn't last long at that job. I have had a great many pets, even at the White House. I've had rabbits, a turkey named Jack, who was intended to be our Christmas dinner, but got lucky when my son Tad asked me to spare him. I even wrote Jack the turkey a formal pardon. Tad had goats, and they were named Nanny and Nanko. I remember how Tad would attach a chair to Nanko, the goat, and ride him around the White House. The staff didn't care for that too much. That goat would even sleep in the bed with Tad. We allowed it. He's such a dear boy. Now, I had a horse, and he was called Abe. Now, that's a nickname I do not care for myself. But I gave that name to the horse instead. And let's see. I had cats, two. One was named Dixie, and the other was Tabby. I spent a lot of time with those two cats. They were very comforting during this terrible war we just had. And I also had brought in a good many strays that would take advantage of my kindness to animals, you could say. I'd always been an animal lover ever since I was a little boy. So you can see I'm quite fond of animals.
Sounds like a lot of fun in the White House.
Yeah, it was a bit of a menagerie.
Now, you've also been known to accept visitors to the White House. Was this ordinary for a president, or was this something that you established yourself?
This was indeed not ordinary. As a matter of fact, when I first started doing it, right from the start of my presidency, one of my chief advisors, Secretary of State Seward, said, "Lincoln, you're going to wear yourself out talking to so many people." And I said, "No, it's important. I need to know what they're thinking." So you could say I did have an open door policy as a president. I held what I called public opinion baths. It's kind of my own little joke. I had visitors, and they were from all walks of life. That's how I met Frederick Douglass, and that's how he met me, in fact. He simply arrived at the White House, and within a short time, I was there to listen to his concerns about the Negroes of the South. My son Tad, seeing all the folks visiting, had quite an enterprising mind because he began to charge a nickel to see me. Well, now he had a good heart, though. He gave the money to what is known, the Us Sanitary Commission. And these are people who are doing God's work. You probably heard of Dorothea Dix and Clara Barton. They're part of this. And they do some wonderful care for our wounded soldiers. And by the way, they never ask what side of the war they're on when they care for them. Of course, when I learned of this, I made Tad stop charging that 5 cents. But I cannot say that. I felt some pride in how he used that money. In fact, that little rascal, he went into our closets, Mary Todd and myself, and he got some of our clothes. He went out and he started selling our clothes out on the lawn. He used the money for the very same thing. That little boy, he is up to mischief quite a bit of the time.
Now, I know that the war has taken quite a lot of your attention, but you also have quite a lot of territories that people are moving out to, and of course, that means that those new lands in the United States need to be connected and easy to get to. Could you speak to us about particularly your work with the railway?
Absolutely. I've seen the importance of the railways from and early on when I was in the legislature in Illinois. I actually championed legislation that created money to improve the infrastructure of Illinois itself, and part of that was the railway. So as president, I did work to connect our territories through the railways. The Pacific Railroad Act was place by July of 1862 and provided government support for building the first transcontinental railway, which would connect the East Coast to the West Coast. And then it was important that we fill our country for our own claim and for use of the land. Also, so in 1862, we came up with the Homestead Act. Now, this granted citizens 160 acres of government land if they were to live on it a certain number of years, at least 5, and to improve and cultivate the land. So those two things helped enormously in our westward expansion.
Now for our visitors today, if you have any last questions for Mr. Lincoln, please put them in the chat now. Any last questions? But Mr. Lincoln, we have also learned that you are an inventor. Now, you are as far as we know, the only president to have a patent issued. Could you talk to us about what you invented?
Yes, I invented a device. After experiencing work on the river as a young man, I was coming back from New York, and we ran into a snag on a river. The family and I had gone to visit Niagara Falls. We were coming back, and through the river, we ran into a snag, and I got this crazy idea that you could put a flotation or a levitation device underneath the boat. Now, it was a device that would buoy a vessel. Once the bladders were inflated, it would raise the vessel up, and then it could overcome shoals or obstructions in the water. So that was the idea. It never caught on, but I think it's an idea that could have worked.
Now, Mr. Lincoln, we know that you have a show to get to, and so we will leave you with this question. As you have come through this Civil War, probably the most challenging experience of your life, could you share with us the hopes that you have for the future of the United States?
Oh, what a fine question indeed. Well, the hopes I have is, by God's will, we don't have any more horrible wars like this, number one. But I think both sides believed they were on following God's will and had God on their side. Perhaps God had a whole other purpose for what we were doing. Who's to know? But the outcome of it was quite good. And I think we can all take a lot of civil pride in knowing that as we emerge, especially onto the world stage, which is what is happening, we are still a shining example of what a republic can be. We are, as I said in my Gettysburg Address, a nation that believes in all men are created equal. And we're dedicated to this proposition of liberty. And we have shown that we can create a way of life, and we have created instruments to correct wrongs. And I think we need to take pride in the fact that although slavery was an abomination, we had tools to rid ourselves of it. And we were criticized worldwide for this, that how could you believe in these principles and then have slavery? But I think we can stand proud and say, as Americans, we have a system in place that allows us to speak freely and to have our own religion that we can pursue at our own pace, and we pursue our own happiness. And there's a lot of countries around us that would love to have our sorts of freedoms. And I think we can stand proud that we ain't perfect, but we've got systems in place and the right fine group of people to keep them in place. And we're going to right wrongs as they come up. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. President, and thank you to all of our visitors to your White House today. And thank you to all of our members for joining us. We will see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks so much.